Growing up in the quiet, unassuming town of Ohio, my life seemed ordinary on the surface, but beneath it lay a simmering tension that would eventually explode. I'm Elliot, 26 years old, and for most of my life, I lived in a modest two-story house with my family. My father, John, a high school math teacher with a stern demeanor. My mother, Lisa, a compassionate nurse who always tried to keep the peace. And my older sister, Gemma, the golden child, who seemed to excel at everything she touched. Gemma, 29, was the epitome of success. She was the star of the family valedictorian of her class, captain of the debate team, and later, a rising star at a prestigious marketing agency in the city. Her achievements cast a long shadow over me, and no matter how hard I tried, I could never measure up. While Gemma thrived, I was the quiet, laid-back sibling who drifted through life, unsure of my place in the world. I attended community college, took odd jobs, and lived at home, all while Gemma's life seemed to unfold like a perfectly scripted movie. Our childhood was a mix of fond memories and unspoken rivalries. Gemma and I were once close, spending hours playing in the backyard, climbing the old oak tree, and inventing elaborate games. But as we grew older, the gap between us widened. Gemma's ambition and drive became a constant reminder of my own lack of direction. By the time she left for college, we were practically strangers, and her occasional visits home only highlighted how far apart we'd grown. The tension in our family wasn't just about success. It was about expectations. My parents adored Gemma, and it was hard not to feel like I was living in her shadow. My father, with his quiet pride, often compared me to her, while my mother tried to reassure me that I'd find my path eventually. But the pressure was always there, lurking beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to erupt. Looking back, I can see how the cracks in our family dynamic were already forming long before the incident that changed everything. Gemma's engagement to Tom, a wealthy lawyer from a prominent family, seemed to magnify those cracks. The engagement party was a lavish affair, filled with people who seemed to belong to a world I could never be part of. I felt out of place, a stranger in my own home, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to go terribly wrong. Little did I know, that feeling would soon become a reality. The events that followed would tear my family apart, leaving me to pick up the pieces of a life I no longer recognized. But in those early days, as I stood in the shadow of Gemma's success, I had no idea how drastically my life was about to change. The engagement of my sister, Gemma, to Tom was supposed to be a joyous occasion, a celebration of love and unity. Instead, it became the catalyst for the unraveling of my life. Tom, a successful lawyer from a wealthy family, was everything my parents admired: polished, ambitious, and seemingly perfect. The engagement party they threw was a grand affair, filled with laughter, champagne, and the kind of people who made me feel like an outsider in my own home. I remember standing in the corner, surrounded by Gemma's sophisticated friends, feeling like I didn't belong. Little did I know, that night would mark the beginning of the end for me. A month after the party, the tension in our house reached a breaking point. It started on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon. I was in my room, lost in the world of video games, when I heard Gemma's voice rise in a panicked scream. I rushed downstairs to find her frantically searching the kitchen, her face pale, and her hands trembling. "My ring is gone," she shouted, her voice shaking with anger and fear. The engagement ring, a family heirloom from Tom's side, was missing, and Gemma was convinced I had taken it. The accusation hit me like a punch to the gut. I denied it immediately, but Gemma's eyes burned with accusation. "You're the only one who was home," she yelled, her voice dripping with venom. She brought up every insecurity I had ever felt, every moment I had struggled to find my place in the family. "You've always been jealous of me," she spat. "You probably sold it to get out of this town and finally do something with your life." My parents, who had always been quick to side with Gemma, didn't hesitate to believe her. My mother's face crumpled in disappointment, tears streaming down her cheeks as she begged me to confess. My father, usually a man of few words, looked at me with a cold, hard stare that cut deeper than any accusation. They turned my room upside down, searching for the ring, but found nothing except for the small amount of cash I had saved from my part-time job at the grocery store. Gemma seized on it immediately, twisting the truth to fit her narrative. "This is proof," she declared, her voice triumphant. "You sold it, and this is the money." No matter how much I protested, no one listened. The walls of my home, once a place of comfort, now felt like a prison closing in on me. My family, the people who were supposed to love and trust me unconditionally, had turned against me in an instant. The betrayal was suffocating, and the weight of their accusations crushed me. Within days, my parents made the unthinkable decision. They told me to leave. "We can't trust you anymore," my father said, his voice cold and final. "You've brought shame to this family." That night, as I packed my belongings into a duffel bag, I felt a mix of anger, heartbreak, and disbelief. How could they believe Gemma over me? How could they throw me out like I was nothing? As I walked out the door, I glanced up and saw Gemma watching me from her bedroom window. For a brief moment, I thought I saw a flicker of doubt in her eyes. But she quickly turned away, leaving me to face the world alone. The moment I stepped out of my family's house, I felt like the ground had been ripped out from under me. I had nowhere to go, no one to turn to, and no idea how to survive on my own. The weight of betrayal pressed down on me as I wandered the streets of our small town, clutching a duffel bag filled with the remnants of my old life. My best friend, Ryan, who had just returned from the army, offered me his couch, but I knew it was only a temporary solution. His apartment was cramped, and I didn't want to burden him with my problems. Still, I was grateful for the lifeline he threw me in my darkest hour. The weeks that followed were a blur of desperation and survival. I took on any job I could find, washing dishes at a diner, walking dogs, even hauling construction materials under the scorching sun. Each day was a battle against exhaustion and despair, but I refused to give up. I had to prove to myself that I could make it on my own, even if my family had abandoned me. The nights were the hardest. I'd lie awake on Ryan's couch, replaying the accusations in my mind, wondering how everything had gone so wrong. The pain of being cast out by the people who were supposed to love me unconditionally was a wound that refused to heal. Eventually, I landed a steady job at a warehouse on the outskirts of town. The work was grueling long hours, heavy lifting, and monotonous tasks, but it gave me a sense of purpose. For the first time in months, I felt like I was building something for myself. The pay wasn't great, but it was enough to rent a small room in a shared house with a few coworkers. It wasn't much, just a cramped space with a bed and a desk, but it was mine. I clung to that small victory like a lifeline. As the months turned into years, I slowly began to rebuild my life. I enrolled in online business management courses, determined to create a future for myself that didn't depend on anyone else. The warehouse job became more than just a paycheck. It became a stepping stone. I worked hard, earned promotions, and eventually became a shift supervisor. It wasn't the life I had imagined for myself, but it was a life I had built with my own 2 hands. Despite the progress I was making, the pain of my family's betrayal never fully went away. I cut off all contact with them, ignoring their calls and messages. My mother left tearful voicemails, begging me to come home, while my father sent terse texts about fixing things. Gemma even showed up at the warehouse once, but I refused to see her. I couldn't face them, not after what they had done. The anger and hurt were still too raw, too overwhelming. Those 3 years were a roller coaster of emotions. There were moments of pride in how far I'd come, but also moments of crushing loneliness. Holidays were especially hard. Seeing families together, laughing and celebrating, was a painful reminder of what I had lost. But through it all, I held on to the belief that I was stronger than the circumstances that had tried to break me. I had survived being cast out, and I was determined to keep moving forward, one step at a time. 3 years had passed since the day I was cast out of my family's home. And in that time, I had built a life for myself, imperfect but mine. I had a steady job, a small apartment, and a sense of independence I had fought hard to achieve. But the shadow of that false accusation still lingered, a constant ache in the back of my mind. I had learned to live with it, to push it down, and focus on the present, but I never truly let it go. And then, out of nowhere, everything changed. It started with an email from my father. The subject line was simple: "We need to talk." My heart raced as I opened it, unsure of what to expect. The message was brief, almost clinical, but it carried a weight that made my hands tremble. They had found the ring. Gemma's engagement ring, the one I had been accused of stealing, had been discovered in the garbage disposal. The truth had finally come to light, and it was as shocking as it was devastating. According to my father, Gemma had accidentally knocked the ring into the disposal while doing the dishes all those years ago. She hadn't realized it at the time, and the ring had been lodged in the machinery, hidden from sight. It wasn't until the disposal started making strange noises that they called a plumber, who discovered the ring during the repair. The moment they found it, the foundation of their accusations crumbled. I had been telling the truth all along. My father's email was filled with apologies and regret, but it did little to ease the storm of emotions raging inside me. Vindication, anger, relief, and sorrow all collided, leaving me breathless. For 3 years, I had carried the weight of their betrayal, and now, with a single email, they wanted to make amends. But how could they undo the damage they had done? How could they erase the years of pain and isolation I had endured? Gemma reached out next, her messages filled with guilt and desperation. She begged for forgiveness, admitting that she had been wrong to accuse me. My mother called, her voice breaking as she apologized for not believing me. They all wanted to meet, to talk, to try to fix what had been broken. But I wasn't ready. The wounds were still too fresh, the memories too vivid. I had spent years rebuilding my life without them, and the thought of letting them back in was terrifying. Part of me wanted to scream at them, to make them feel even a fraction of the pain they had caused me. Another part of me longed for the family I had lost, for the comfort of belonging somewhere. I was torn between the desire for justice and the hope for reconciliation. In the end, I agreed to meet them, not because I was ready to forgive, but because I needed closure. I needed to face them, to see the regret in their eyes, and to decide if there was any way to move forward. The truth had set me free, but it had also reopened old wounds. As I prepared to meet my family, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of a new chapter, one filled with uncertainty, pain, and the possibility of healing. The meeting with my family was one of the hardest things I've ever done. We agreed to meet at a small coffee shop in a neighboring town, a neutral ground where the weight of our shared history wouldn't feel quite so suffocating. As I sat there, waiting for them to arrive, my heart pounded in my chest. 3 years of anger, pain, and loneliness had built up inside me, and I wasn't sure if I was ready to face them. When they walked in, it was like a punch to the gut. My mother looked older, her face lined with guilt and regret. My father, usually so stoic, seemed smaller, as if the weight of his mistakes had worn him down. And Jemoshi couldn't even look me in the eye. The conversation was awkward and emotional, filled with tears and apologies. My parents admitted they had failed me, that they had let their pride and Gemma's accusations cloud their judgment. They told me how much they regretted kicking me out, how they had spent every day since wondering how they could have been so blind. Gemma, through sobs, confessed that she had been consumed by her own insecurities, and had taken her frustrations out on me. She said she had always looked up to me, even though I was younger, and that her jealousy had twisted her perception of me. Hearing their apologies was both cathartic and painful. Part of me wanted to forgive them, to let go of the anger and start fresh, but another part of me couldn't forget the years of pain and isolation I had endured because of their actions. I told them I needed time to process everything, to heal, and to decide if I could ever trust them again. I set clear boundaries. I wasn't ready to move back home or pretend nothing had happened. If we were going to rebuild our relationship, it would have to be on my terms. In the weeks that followed, I started therapy to help me navigate the complex emotions I was feeling. My therapist helped me unpack the trauma of being falsely accused and abandoned by my family. We talked about the years of feeling like I wasn't good enough, of living in Gemma's shadow, and how those experiences had shaped me. Therapy wasn't easy. It forced me to confront painful truths about myself and my family, but it was necessary. Slowly, I began to heal. At the same time, I made a life-changing decision. I accepted a job offer in a new city. It was a management position at a logistics company, a significant step up from my warehouse job. The opportunity felt like a chance to start over, to leave behind the town that held so many painful memories and build a new life for myself. My therapist supported the decision, saying it could be a fresh start, a way to reclaim my independence and focus on my future. When I told my family about the move, their reactions were mixed. My mother cried, saying she had hoped we'd have more time to reconnect before I left. My father, though disappointed, said he understood. Gemma took it the hardest. She showed up at my apartment unannounced, begging me not to go. "I feel like I'm losing you all over again," she said, her voice breaking. It was a difficult conversation, but I held my ground. I told her this was something I needed to do for myself, and that our relationship wasn't in a place where her opinion could influence my decision. The move was both exhilarating and terrifying. The new city was bustling and unfamiliar, a stark contrast to the quiet town I had grown up in. My job was challenging but rewarding, and I threw myself into it, determined to prove myself. I rented a small apartment, started exploring the city, and even made a few friends. For the first time in years, I felt like I was truly living for myself, not in someone else's shadow. My family and I kept in touch, but it was slow and cautious. Weekly phone calls with my mother, occasional texts from my father, and a tentative effort to rebuild trust with Gemma. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. Therapy helped me navigate the complexities of these relationships, teaching me how to set healthy boundaries and prioritize my own well-being. Looking back, I realized how much I had grown. The betrayal that had once shattered me had also made me stronger. I had built a life from nothing, proven my resilience, and learned to value myself in ways I never had before. While I still carried the scars of the past, I no longer let them define me. I had forgiven my family not for their sake, but for mine. Letting go of the anger and bitterness had freed me to focus on the future. The story doesn't end with a perfect reconciliation or a happily ever after. Life is messier than that, but it ends with hope for a future where I can continue to grow, to heal, and to build a life that is entirely my own. And maybe, just maybe, there's hope for my family too.